This video is an overview of the Maya interface. As you can see, there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of buttons, there's a lot of boxes, a lot of panels, and there are a lot more that are hidden. So it's actually quite a challenge to both learn this and to show it. The reason it's a challenge to show it is I think if I was going to do a comprehensive video about the Maya interface, it would take hours, I think, to actually do it. So I'm just going to do a very comprehensive and basic introduction to the interface. I'm going to kind of break it down into the kind of roadmap, if you like, which can be, you can see the roadmap by, if I'm going to hold, I'm now holding the space bar with my mouse hovering in this panel here, and you can see that there is a whole bunch of menus here. These are the same menus that you find up here. The reason that you can access a lot more of the menus down here is because basically there's not enough room on a standard computer monitor to fit all of these menus in. You probably need 5 or 6 monitors. So you do have this hotbox in Maya which accesses all the menus. And the menus are organized in a categorical way. What I mean by that is you've got in these bars here. So this top bar is reflecting the tools at the top here, which is related to running the software. Things related to, well, basic stuff like opening, saving, and making new files, editing, things like copying and pasting, creating objects like cubes or spheres, other things, cameras, etc. Selecting things is just holding down your mouse to select an object. I'll go into a bit more detail about that. And there's other things that are related to managing the software here. This next box here is related to what you're seeing in this panel. So for example, if I was to go to create a polygon primitive sphere, there's a polygon primitive sphere. I'm pressing F for Freddy, to focus or frame that sphere. Now, if I was to go in these shading panels here, for example, if I went wireframe, you can see that sphere as a wireframe. If I set this to smooth shade, you see that shaded. So this box or this row of menus here is related to what you're seeing in these panels. I'm just going to click on the 4-panel button there. You can see the cube in these other panels here. I'm going to stick with the hotbox. It's very tempting to go off on tangent because Maya is a kind of non-linear interface. What I mean by that is it's something you dip in and out of. So you can think of it as more like quite a complex network of tools, modules, and by modules I mean different bits of software embedded within Maya. So the reason I'm showing you this hotbox is it gives you I'm just going to put that back on one view, is the hotbox can show you kind of where things are. So you could think of this as kind of neighborhoods if you want, or I sometimes think of it as like a department store. So you might have a clothing floor, you might have a furniture floor, you might have a food floor. So there will be departments where you find different things, and I would suggest the way you explore Maya is the same way. If you went into a department store and you wanted to buy a pair of socks, you probably wouldn't go to the food hall or the furniture department. You'd go to the clothing department, and then you might have a look around and see whether there were kind of smaller items perhaps. So you would have a logical kind of way of navigating towards something, even if you don't know where it actually is located. It's going to be in a place appropriate to that kind of tool or function or set of options. So Maya is basically things do exist in relevant places. So as I said, the top bar here is related to running and driving the software. This bar here is related to how this appears here, and if I press 4, that is also shifting into wireframe, and 5 shifting into shaded view. So 4 and 5, 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded, and that's the same. You will find that same option in this this box here. Just for now, you can ignore these 3. Well, these are the hotbox controls, which is this thing that I'm using at the moment. The hotbox is this set of menus, this box of menus. The next tool, the next bar down, is tools related to surfaces. So by a surface, an example of a surface is this sphere. I'm going to delete that and get another type of object. So I'm going to create this time a polygon primitive cube. So these are all surfaces which are polygon objects that are made of polygons. Okay, and I'll go into more details about the nature of surfaces and polygons. There are different types of surfaces as well. Again, I'm not going to go into that now, but surfaces include polygons and other types of surfaces. Now you can see that well, before I go into how I'm navigating like this, I'm going to go to some more of these boxes here. So this is the things related to creating and editing surfaces. This one down here is related to what's called rigging, and rigging is basically creating a 3D digital puppet and putting controls on it so you can animate that puppet character. This is related to animating, so keying, playbacks, visualizing, visualizing an animation, deforming things, like maybe squashing things in particular ways, possibly twisting something, bending something. Constraints are related to pinning one object to another object. So, and there are other ways of pinning objects together. We probably, what some of you towards in your final projects may be using these particles and effects. So this box here enables you to do things like smoke and fire and special effects, cloth effects, etc. And finally, this lighting, shading, and texturing box here is related to rendering, and that the lighting and shading is a different type of lighting and shading to the lighting and shading here. The lighting and shading here refers to lighting and shading when you're outputting, you create a movie from your animation. So for example, we've been using the Playblast tool to create some very basic movies, but this is when you create final output movies, which you may then, well, they could be image sequences like streams of JPEGs or streams of PNGs, or they could be movies that you can then take into an editing software, perhaps like After Effects or Premiere, where you can do further editing, or you could even have final outputs coming straight from lighting, shading, and rendering. So this is the hotbox, and basically I'm trying to summarize that these different bars on the hotbox, or the sub boxes on the hotbox, are groups of related functions and tools. Okay, so that's the hotbox. You can actually, just while we're on that, talking about the menus, you can go into this little button here below File, Edit, Create, and you can access different modules. When I do that, if I change this module, the animation module, notice some of these menus here change, and these are the same menus that you might find in here. So if you don't want to use the hotbox, there are other ways to access all the menus through these buttons here. Personally, I find the hotbox a lot easier to deal with. I don't jump around between different modules. But that's my preferences, and different people have different ways of preferred ways of using software. Uh, so we've kind of covered how the menus work and the categories of different types, sets of menus. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the interface. I think the first thing I might do, so I'm going to go back to four panels here. So these four panels, this is the top panel and it's looking down the y-axis. So you have your x, y and z of 3 dimensions. So the x generally refers to the horizontal. So here on the front view, for example, I'm tapping the space bar to maximize this panel. This is the front view, and you can see in the bottom of these panels is a little X, Y, Z, and you can see that this is the X. So the horizontal here is the X axis, the vertical is the Y axis, and we're looking down the front, which is the Z, so we're looking along the Z. This is the side view, so we're looking at the Z axis and the Y axis, and we're looking down the X. So we're kind of looking at these two, looking at 90 degrees. It's as if the y-axis is turned 90 degrees and you're looking down one way and then you're looking across. So this may be looking along and you can think maybe this is looking across. If this was a stage, this would be like the audience view of the stage. This would be looking out from the wings of the stage across the stage, and then the top view is looking down onto the stage from above. So that's looking along the y-axis. So you've got your x, y, z appropriate to each of these. These are called orthographic views. These are two-dimensional views, just looking down one axis and depicting two axes. The three-dimensional view, or your perspective view, is a kind of simulation of our experience in a 3D space. And I can move around in that space. So I'm going to tap my space bar to maximize that perspective view. And if I now hold down Alt, so the Alt key, which is next to the space bar, and I'm holding my left mouse button, and I'm moving around, I'm orbiting the camera. This is a camera, by the way, and in this box here is your outline, and you see the camera there. So this camera is being moved around and it's looking at a central point and orbiting around that point. I'm doing that by holding down Alt and left mouse button. Keep Alt held down. I hold down middle mouse button. I'm panning around, panning from side to side and up and down. So the camera is kind of staying on one plane and moving sideways or up and down. And then finally, if I keep Alt held down and hold my right mouse button, this is traveling the camera backwards and forwards. So I'm moving towards and away from a particular point of view. Let's just move. So if I was to combine those three movements, let me create a polygon primitive. I'm going to create a torus, which is like a donut shaped object. So I'm holding Alt and let me duplicate that object by I'm holding Control D to duplicate it. I'm going to move it across. And I'm going to rotate it, and I'll go into these tools in a minute. So if I wanted to focus on this object, I could select it and press F and move around. Alternatively, I could just move I'm holding the Alt middle mouse button. I can move that around and move towards it and away from it. If I want to change, and I can shift over to this object, and now the center of the camera's view is on that object, and I can orbit around that object, move towards it and away from it. So I'm using left mouse button to orbit, middle mouse button to pan, and right mouse button with Alt to dolly or track backwards and forwards. Okay, so I briefly started to rotate and move one of these objects. Do that using the tools here. And now I'm drawing your attention to three tools. There's the select tool. So you notice if I put the select tool on, I can click in a blank area, that would deselect, and if I click on something, that will select. Deselect, select. I'm left clicking. Now there's some more tools here. So this is the move tool. This enables me to move in X, Y, and Z. Now the three axes are indicated. X is indicated as being red, Y is indicated as being green, but notice as you hover over something it changes colour. So as soon as I hover on something, it can be selected axis is indicated as being yellow. So you can now see the X, the red one, X red, Y green, and Z blue. So I can move along these three axes. You notice these little squares here. So these squares, this red square is, so this is the red, the arrow is the red axis, the square is the red, is the plane of X. So now I'm moving about on the plane of X. And if I click on the green one, it's moving around on the plane of Y, and the blue one is moving around on the plane of Z. So and then there's a little square in the middle. If I left click, that moves my object parallel to the view or the camera that I'm looking through. So this is the move tool, and it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 components to this manipulator. So this bunch of icons that are kind of knitted together to form these arrows and planes, and this little square in the middle is called a manipulator. It's where you manipulate things. So this is the move manipulator, sometimes called the translate manipulator. The one below it here is the rotate manipulator, and you can see instead of having arrows, it's got these circles. So there's the X one, the Y one, the Z one, and this big one outside is, again, it's rotating parallel to the camera that I'm looking through. So if I shift around, I'm rotating parallel to this camera. And if I click in these, you notice as I hover over these segments, they go slightly darker, and if I left hold on here, I can kind of roll this whole thing around in a kind of free rolling effect. And then finally we have the scale tool, which kind of looks a bit like the move tool, except instead of moving you scale, scaling Y now, or scaling in X, scaling in Z, or I can scale in two axes. So if I click on the Y plane, scale it in X and Z. If I click on the X plane, it scales it in Y and Z. And if I click on the blue one, it scales it in X and Y. Okay, so, and you can access these three tools by pressing W for the move tool. So just look at where W, E and R on the keyboard. In fact, look at the Q as well. So the top left 4 keys on your keyboard is Q, W, E and R. So Q is a shortcut for the selection tool. And the selection tool just selects or deselects an object. W is the move tool. E is the rotation tool. and R is the scale tool. So those are the basic tools. And this, next to the toolbox, you will see the outliner, which is a list of all the objects in your scene. And these 4 objects here are your 4 panels, your 4 cameras. Perspective is this one. Top is this one. Front and side. So you can think of these cameras as objects in their own right. Ignore this stuff for the minute. Default light set, default object set. We can talk about sets later down the line. But you can also see that this I can select also in my outliner. I can select an object. In fact, if I select that, I'll deselect it here, I'll select it here, deselect it. Whilst we're on this column here, you've got your perspective view, 4 views. This is your outliner here. And there are a bunch of other ways, sets of views that you can use. But again, I think I'm not going to show you too much stuff. I would just get down to the basics. As I said before, it would take hours to go through every single bit on every single, or even a small proportion of the stuff that's in Maya. So we're going to limit the stuff that we're going to look at. So, and on the right hand side, if you notice, if I select this object, you have a kind of information here. This is the channel box, and you might see that you also not always see these tabs here, but if you do see them, they're usually the channel box, the attribute editor, which is something very similar to the channel box, and you may see the modeling toolkit there, but they're not always nested there. Another way of getting up the channel box is to just click on that, and you can see it's actually disappeared from here. So I can select the channel box here, I can select the attribute editor here, sorry, that's the tool settings. This is the attribute editor. Select it there, or select it here. The tool one I accidentally clicked on is tool settings. So these are the different tool settings, and if I was to double click on one of these, so if I double click on the move tool, I get the tool settings. So you get a different set of tools. The tool settings box is going to be different depending on the tool you use. There are lots of other tools as well, which the tool settings panel will access. But just for now, let's keep looking at the basic tools of move, rotate, and scale. Again, it's not practical to get into all of these aspects of the tool settings. This is just a basic overview. Now, this is a useful thing to do is to zero stuff out. So I've been moving this torus around quite a lot, scaling it and moving it. So I'm going to reset it, and I'm going to do that by getting my translation and rotation channels. Select those, left hold and drag to make those light blue. I'm going to type 0 there on my keyboard, press enter. It will reset this to 0, but you notice it's still deformed, it's still squashed around a bit there. And if I set the scaling back to 1, so you can see the different values for scaling. Scaling is 1, it goes back to its original shape. I'm pressing F to focus on that object, and you can reset things back to their default settings by, remember the scale, if the scaling was 0, it would be infinitely small and it would be invisible. So if I was to make that 0, you wouldn't be able to see it. We don't want that. So I put that back to 1. I can also change these, type these values in, so I could make that 5 in Y, which is going to make it look like that. So you can actually enter numerical values here. But you will notice as I move or rotate, you can see that value of X changing there. So I'm going to put that back to 0. So this is now we've kind of shifted into looking at the channel box. Again, there's a lot of stuff here. I'm going to go over, you can see that there are some other inputs here that you can do things with, but again, I'm not going to go into that. It's not going to be helpful for getting the basics now. But what is useful is looking at the layers editor. So if you've used Photoshop, you're probably familiar with the concept of layers, and it's very similar. I mean, it's not similar in the way you might change things, but the concept is similar to Photoshop layers, except these are three-dimensional layers. So now, if I have this object selected, again, I'm not going to go into all these buttons. This button here will create a layer and add the selected object, and it comes up as layer 1. But let's say I want to change the name of that layer. I can double click on it and call this layer, I'm going to call it Geo, short for geometry, because I've got some geometry in there. I'm going to put it underscore layer. Whenever you name things, I strongly suggest you substitute an underscore for Maya won't accept a space anyway, but when naming things for computer graphics imaging processes, I would always use an underscore as a substitute for a space. So I'm going to save that layer. So this is my layer here, and if there's V, ignore P stands for playback. We don't need to think about that right now. V makes that layer visible or invisible. Because the object is still selected, you can see the move tool there. So visibility is switched on and off here. V is visible, no V is invisible. You can also, I'd say, ignore that P button. This little button, blank button here, if I click on it once and left clicking, you can see it goes pink, or if I deselect it, it goes grey. So this is a template. This means the object is templated, or any objects or objects in that layer are templated, which means you can see it, but you cannot interact with it. If I click on the T again, it comes up with an R, which means it's a referenced object. Again, and that means I can now see it in a more shade, in this case, a shaded view, because my view is shaded. So I can see it more clearly, but I cannot select it. Now there's another difference to something being referenced. It doesn't mean you can snap to it, but again, I don't think we've got time to get deep into things, a lot of the sub routines like snapping and stuff, although I will shortly discuss that very briefly. So the reference means you can reference an object. When this is blank, it means the layer is basically active. T is a template. R, it's a reference. And when there's nothing, when that button's blank, the layer is active, and you can select and deselect and move objects within that layer. Again, we don't need to go into all of these buttons right here, and there are different types of layers. Again, just think about, you only need at this point to worry about display layers. Now, oh yeah, I haven't mentioned shelves. So shelves are basically different. So we looked at these three tools, and the shelves are different sets of tools. You have different tools related to different functions in the shelves. So for example, in poly modeling, you've got tools related to modeling in polygons. Again, you don't need to, you probably never need to use most of this stuff. Don't attempt to try and learn it. It's just not humanly possible, because you've got hundreds, maybe there's probably thousands of functions within Maya, maybe more if you think of all the options you get. There's just not, it's not learnable. So don't even think about thinking you need to learn everything, because you can't, and you won't. The poly modeling is something you might use a lot. So if I was going to delete this, I can create a different type of object by clicking on one of these. This has now created a cylinder. So you can create objects here, or I can do things to the objects. I'm going to delete this object's history, which is edit delete by type history, and I'm going to again another day I'm going to talk about history in more detail. So I'm going to select a face here. If I select this face, I can also now start moving components about as well. Now you might often find that you're working and maybe a missed mouse click, you suddenly see everything kind of blue, maybe even with pink little dots around it, and that can be quite confusing. That's because you've gone into component mode. Component mode is basically when you're editing components of objects, not the objects. If you see this turn blue and pink and you can't, it's interacting in a way you didn't expect or didn't want. If I right hold here, I get an array of menus, and one of those menus is object mode. This will take me back to object mode, so I can come back to being in object mode. There's also two buttons here which switch between object and component mode. Frustratingly, those buttons aren't always synced with shifting between component and object mode here. I don't know why that isn't built into the software, because I would have expected that to switch to component mode when I switch to component mode here. But whoever, there's a whole team who designed Maya, the team have decided that that doesn't happen. I never understood why this doesn't automatically switch, but it doesn't, which is a bit of a nuisance in my opinion. But anyway, so that's object mode and component mode, or you can switch between them here. So there are many different shells. Okay, so if I select, say, this face, and another tool here that we probably will use a lot at some point is to extrude a face. That's this button. And that means I can start to add components, in this case faces. You can see how this could start being used as a modeling. Well, it is a modeling tool. Go back to component object mode. So I'll start to change the shape of that cylinder. You can also see that extrusion operation has come into the channel box as well. But again, we'll discuss that in more detail another time. I'm going to just introduce you to the attribute editor a little bit more. We did touch on it before. The attribute editor is like a much more detailed version of the channel box. So the attribute editor, notice the attribute editor's got a lot of tabs here, including actually that last poly extrude face that I put in here, so I can do stuff in here that's related to that function that I just generated by extruding that face. You can see there are different tabs here. These different tabs refer to different nodes. So Maya basically is what's called an object-oriented program, which means it consists of chunks of information that are called nodes. And for example, so the cylinder itself is a node, but also its position is a node as well. So this is the transform node. For example, what I'm moving about is a transform node, but the geometry is the shape node. So Maya is node-based software. That means it's got lumps of information that will be representing different things, and a node could be a color of something. So for example, I can assign a new material. I'm just going to assign a very simple material, a new Lambert material, and I can make that different colors. In fact, I've done that on that face. This, if I go back to object mode, if I click through here, you will also see now there's Lambert. So a color is also a node. A piece of geometry is a node, and an object's position and rotation is also a node. I don't want to go too deep into some things because I don't want to confuse people who are just starting with this. but the node concept is pretty central to Maya. And I think if you get, and it's a bit abstract to start with, but if you just have a basic knowledge of it, I think it leads you into understanding Maya a bit quicker than just dealing with what you see. I think it's useful to have some understanding of what's going on under the bonnet, so to speak. So bear in mind this concept that Maya, you're manipulating objects that are nodes. And so I can, if I go to my Windows and something called General Editors, Hypergraph hierarchy. You can see this object here. If I create another object, there's another object there. Now, at the moment you can see there are two objects here, so there are two nodes. But if I select this object, and now if I go into, if I click on this button, this button here, so this is the hierarchy node, and this is the input and output, this is the not hierarchy node, this is showing you the hierarchy nodes. So if I make this a child of that, I've now made the cylinder parent of the torus, and the torus will follow the cylinder. And these are indicated, this is indicated as a child of the cylinder. But if I move the torus, the child doesn't follow the parent, but the parent doesn't follow the child, but the child follows the parent. Now, so this is, you can view these nodes in hierarchical relationships, or you can review them as, so this is like a vertical way. It's not vertical necessarily spatially, but conceptually these are organized vertically as a hierarchy. But if you look at the input and outputs, so you can see various things. For example, there is that one of those Lamberts. That's that pink. That node is the pink color that you see there. This node here, the polyextrude face, was actually pulling one of these things where I extruded the face. So you can see that there's a whole way that things are related to each other in terms of these nodes. You don't get too worried about this now, but bear in mind that this node-based way that things relate to each other is kind of how Maya works. So without getting don't necessarily try and understand it too much now. Just be aware that Maya is a node-based software, and as you learn Maya, I will be showing you more stuff related to how nodes relate to each other, because it's basically how the software works. Okay, enough of that, I think. So just to show you that those things are there. So what else? So, and then we got our timeline. So this is the timeline. So if I key this object here, I'm going to press Shift W. You can see that these translation values are turned red. See them in the attribute editor. Also see them there, they turn red as well in their channel box. I'm going to go to a different time. I'm going to move this. I'm going to press Shift W. Again, Shift W is remember W is move, E is rotate, and R is scale. So if I press Shift W, that will key a position, a move. Let's go to another time and I'm going to move that maybe up a bit. Key that again, Shift W. So maybe add some rotations. Let's key a rotation as well. Shift E. Let's do that and rotate that. Shift E. So I'm keying now different types of transformation, some rotation, and some translation. Maybe do a bit of scale as well. Shift R. press Shift R there, and then if I scale this, pressing R to get the scale tool. Key that again, Shift R. So you see some keys. Now S is also keys, and S, I wouldn't use S. I'm going to undo what I just did, undo all those keys. If I press S, I'm going to go in, first of all, I'm going to go to key, set key, and if I reset the tool settings and apply that. Now if I press S when this is down, it keys everything. Now you might think, well, that's really useful. Pressing S, it just keys everything. It saves me pressing Shift W, Shift D, keying different things, but that is actually, it can lead to tying you down to things that you may not want to press. You might not want everything keyed, you might only want specific channels keyed. So I don't like doing that because it creates a lot more information and data, and it creates keys that you may not want. So unless you change the way S works, I wouldn't use S. Again, I'm going to undo those keys. And I have already introduced S on some of the lessons, but if I was going to key this now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the settings for the keying. I'm going to go key, and go to the set key options, and I'm going to change this to all keyable attributes from the channel box. I'm going to do that, show you that again. So all keyable attributes, which means basically these are the keyable attributes. The keyable attributes of the channels. So again, now you can see that there is a relationship between attribute editor and channel box, because attributes, well, they are channels in a way. Some attributes aren't necessarily channels, but channels and attributes do overlap and are kind of different ways of talking about the same thing. So I've done all keyable attributes, so all channels, stroke attributes, and then I've set it from the channel box, which means that if I've got a channel selected in the channel box, now click apply, it just keys the selected channel. I'm pressing S. So I'm now keying specifically in channel S. It's now keyed that movement in the Z axis. So I think when you're animating, and particularly if you're animating characters, using the S that's been set up with the options to all keyable attributes from channel box, especially when you have complex characters with lots of different controls and many different channels, it is much more useful to be specific in how you key things than just keying everything. Okay, so we've looked at this, the timeline, so I've navigated my timeline. It's something I can show you in the timeline that's useful. If I right hold, and if I go to playback speed, if I play every frame on, now I've got some animation on that. If I put play every frame on, see how it's whacking through really quickly? I don't want that, so I'm going to go there. Playback speed, real time. Again, there are lots of more options in there that will take a week to go through. So that's now playing in real time, which basically is 24 frames a second. So, and then just finally, I'm going to, so yeah, there's your playback forwards, play backwards, stop that. Jump to the next, so if I jump back to the next keyframe, which is the red dots, the red indicators here, so I can jump backwards and forwards between keyframes. I can play forwards or play backwards, jump to a keyframe, stop that, go back one frame, forward one frame, go to the end, go to the beginning. There's my range slider. So I can choose to look at a particular bit of time by moving the range slider. This button here, there's lots of buttons which we don't need to really worry about right now. If I click on this, it takes me to it takes me directly to the animation preferences, or rather the time slider preferences. But it does also take you to all of the preferences. So again, the preferences are arranged in categories or chapters, however you want to think about it. So they've got all the different preferences from Maya in here. You can also access different windows by going Windows, General Editor. So I can go to preferences here as well. Or you can go to, there's all different sort of Windows, General Editor, or maybe the connection editor will be something we use later that connects things to each other. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over, summarize what we've been looking at. So you've got your menus up here, which you can access different categories of menus here. Alternatively, you can hold your spacebar and get the hot box. You can access all of the menus here without having to go to different categories. Oh, just one thing I haven't mentioned really. If you go to, for example, if I go in a menu, you can see there some menus have got an arrow pointing off, an arrow takes you to a sub menu. If there's no arrow and no little box, that will just do one thing, and it's created that locator. So an arrow takes you to a sub menu. If there's nothing on the right, it's just a single operation and it will do that operation. Or if there's a little box, it gives you have an options box that you can use to set up parameters for, depending on what it is you want to do. In this case, there's an Illustrator curve, and I'm not going to make it, but you can create an Illustrator curve. Or maybe a better example would be if I went to Polygon Primitive Cube, excuse me, cube, I can set the parameters for that cube, and if I set let's say I set the height to 6, I've got a nice tall cube which is basically 6 plus units high. There you go. I can also adjust that there, and earlier I did mention history. If I delete the history of that, it will get rid of this information, which is the generating information. Edit, delete by type history. There's also a keyboard shortcut for deleting the history, which is Shift Alt D. Okay, so as I said earlier at the beginning, there is loads and loads of stuff here, but I've kind of made a summary, a very basic summary of Maya, without trying not to spill into too many tangential details. So we've got categories here. So basically driving the software, how it displays in these views here. These are tools related to modeling. These are tools related to setting up a character for animating. It's called rigging. You might also notice there's a rigging shelf. These are shelves with different tools. So a lot of the stuff you see in the shelves, well, everything you see in the shelves is found in the menus, although there are things in the menus which aren't in the shelves. So things related to rigging, skeletons, etc. Keying, which we've looked at by changing the set key things. So this is all keying, playback is related to forming, is related to animating, and this is relating to effects, stuff like this. A lot of stuff you may probably never ever use. I mean, I don't mind. I know some of these things, fluids and stuff, can be useful for more advanced projects. We won't be using them initially. And then lighting, shading, texturing is related to outputting your files to JPEGs or movies. So those are the basic. That's the basic menu structure. You've got your status bar here, which has got various tools. For example, we can look at our tool settings, turn the channel box on and off. There's some render settings things here up in the status bar. So status bar is also related to driving software. There's a lot of buttons here which are related to selecting or masking selections. So I can make it so I can't select skeletons, for example, or I can't select. If I had to put that on, for example, I now cannot select polygons or surfaces, but I'll put that back on. So various tools up here, many of them. Shelves, which have different, just collections of different tools related to different functions, animation shelf, modeling shelf. Our tools here, these are different types of panels, ways of looking at Maya. Again, there are keyboard shortcuts. Tap the space bar, that does some similar things. You can turn off the outliner or turn it on here. Channel box shows you information about any given object. Attribute editor, greater details about the selected objects. With the channel box, you've got the layer editor as well, so we can put things in layers. So if I add this, add selected objects, because it's not visible, so I can manage my layers here. Timeline, playback, fast forward, go to the beginning, range slider so I can focus on a bit of the timeline. Set your keyframes. At the moment there's 200 frames, but maybe I wanted this to be 500, type that in. Then I got what, 500 frame animation. You don't need to know about Mel. You do have a script editor here, which again is going to be when we get a bit more advanced. Maybe this can be useful, kind of troubleshooting thing, so we can go back. So everything, when I do something, it actually has a little bit of coding. It's coding basically. So clicking on that and saying select PQ1 or select torus. There's the torus. So there's little bits of coding in here, which is Mel, and that's put in. This is executing a bit of code, and you can see that in the script editor. So maybe there's a problem. If you have a problem, sometimes the script editor can be useful in finding out where you may have gone wrong with something, perhaps. Again, I wouldn't worry about the script editor for now. What else? We've got our panels, 3 orthographic views, a perspective view. These are cameras. Each panel has its own set of menus as well. Again, we can get into more details about this. This is a useful thing. You see here it's got a vertex count, so that is something under display. I can go to heads up display and turn this poly. That's my poly count. I tend to quite like having the poly count on, so under display this can be useful. So again, like I said at the outset, I could go into a huge amount of detail about this. I hope that's been a useful introduction to Maya's interface, and I hope it's not been too intimidating of the software. I think what you've got to do is learn how to look through all the stuff of what you're seeing in Maya, and there's a lot of stuff you just can ignore. And it's intimidating because it makes you think, oh, I've got to know this and I've got to know that. You don't need to know. You only need to know a tiny percentage of all the stuff you see with Maya in order to do. You're focusing on animation. There's a lot of stuff in Maya that does a lot of other things. You just need to. The thing about learning to use Maya, I think, and in the context of learning to use it for animation, is you just want to identify the animation tools that you need to use. Um, and just take your time, and you will build up your knowledge of Maya as you go. So that's a summary of Maya's interface. I hope it's not too confusing or difficult to follow. Um, so yeah, I think I've covered the basics, and yeah, you will see. This is gonna go into the an octo. So I'll see you when I see you. Thank you.